So as one example of how money has played out around photo ID, let's take an example of Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo in the middle here in the orange. John Campbell, the Executive Vice President of Wells Fargo, is also the chair of the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce. You can see here the sort of dollars that have run down into these campaign funnels. We have over $400,000 from the Chamber down to the Minnesota Coalition for Businesses. We have $116,000 making its way all the way to the House Republican Campaign Committee and the Senate Victory Fund. From there, these funnels, and it's important to note, Minnesota Forward, the Minnesota Business Partnership, the Coalition for Minnesota Businesses, all share the same obscure suite somewhere in downtown Minneapolis. Now route these dollars directly into campaign expenditures, either campaign contributions going directly to candidates or independent expenditures. So for example, right, the Coalition for Minnesota Businesses has spent more than $1 million to elect Republicans in the last cycle. Okay? It's an example of how the dollars of the wealthiest executives at these major banks are using their influence funneled here to move a legislative agenda that's now restricting the right to vote. That is its primary goal. These organizations have put almost $100,000 into the campaigns of House Speaker Kurt Zellers and House Majority Leader Matt Dean. Both Zeller and Dean are members of ALEC. Both are sponsors of the Photo ID Amendment. Furthermore, once Republicans assumed control of the legislature, authors Senator Scott Walker and Representative Mary Kiffmeyer, who is the state chair of ALEC, were placed in positions to advance their campaign to restrict access to voting. So here's the question we need to ask. Why would banking executives spend considerable time and money enacting a legislative agenda in which the lead item is to make it harder for law-abiding voters in Minnesota to exercise their right to vote? Well, consider Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo profited from crashing our economy. They received almost $44 billion in bailout money from taxpayers. In both 2009 and in 2010, they made $12 billion. That's $24 billion total in profit. Despite this, Wells Fargo paid less in federal income taxes from 2008 to 2010 than the average Minnesota household. To hang on to their extraordinary wealth and to avoid paying their fair share of taxes, top Wells Fargo executives have funded a cuts-only approach to governing. The victims of these cuts, the elderly, college students, the working poor, to name just a few, have paid a price. Simply put, it's not in the political self-interest of these Wells Fargo executives and the politicians they fund that the victims of their cuts-only approach to governing exercise their right to vote. Instead of returning taxpayer money to the economy, instead of saving Minnesotans' homes or working to protect our schools during a foreclosure crisis, Wells Fargo, TCF, and U.S. Bank executives and their board members have donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to members of the Minnesota legislature and the Republican caucus to make it harder for the rest of the 99% of the population to vote. I want to turn to the second chart here. Legislators who are sponsoring voter ID amendments. What you have here is a sense of how these dollars actually influence individual candidates. Individual sources, Speaker Kurt Zellers, a total of $36,400 coming from bank resources. Over here is what the Republican Party has spent in independent expenditures on his behalf. You can see that a number of these people right here who are now sponsoring the voter ID amendment have been elected in 2008 or 2010, where, as you can see in the report, is really where banks began to double down in terms of investing in legislative races. It's clear when you see the sort of dollars that are behind this, the influence the banks have. But if you turn to page 10 in the report, you can see the significance of this. And I think this is important to understand, that, first of all, the money that banks are spending dwarfs the dollars candidates themselves are raising. You can see at the top of that list Roger Crawford. Total independent expenditures on his behalf, $70,000. Total contributions, dollars he raised, $15,000. Total independent expenditures, total money from banks, $39,000, almost $40,000. That's almost half of all the money spent on his behalf coming from banks. That's the sort of extraordinary influence that we see. And you can see on this list that those that have been part of the takeover recently in the Minnesota legislature, on this list, upwards of 1/3 to half of the resources being spent on their behalf are coming from these banking institutions. The real conversation we need to be having in our state is who stands to gain from a photo ID amendment. Clearly, the executives of our largest banks, Wells Fargo, TCF, US Bank, all have a vested interest in reducing the voter rolls. Those that suffer the most from a cuts-only approach to governing that is funded by top bank executives and implemented by the legislative Republicans are the same people who suffer the most under a photo ID amendment. We're asking for two things. First, that the bankers who profited from crashing our economy stop flooding our elections with money and stop using that money to rewrite the rules of the game to benefit themselves. Secondly, we're asking that legislators turn their attention to creating jobs and stop trying to restrict the vote. With that, I'll turn it over to Gene Nichols, a board member at TakeAction Minnesota.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning. My name is Gene Nichols, Nichols. I am a member of the Board of Directors of TakeAction Minnesota, a sustaining member of TakeAction, and an active on our Healthcare Now campaign team. I want to start my comments this morning by taking a line from Dan McGrath's comments. The elderly, college students, the working poor, and people of color are those who will disproportionately suffer the most under a photo ID amendment. I became involved with TakeAction Minnesota because I knew they had been working for more than 8 years to protect and expand voting participation in Minnesota. Over the years, our work has been about removing barriers to voting and ensuring poll access for all law-abiding citizens. TakeAction Minnesota believes that the more voices there are in the decision-making process of our government, the stronger our democracy is in meeting all of the needs of all of our citizens. I oppose the photo ID amendment. I oppose it because I do not want to go back to a time of my great-grandparents in Virginia who were denied the right to vote. I do not want to live the life of my grandparents who would tell me stories of the subtle barriers and hardships they faced in Connecticut and New York, when all they wanted to do was have a voice in our country's business. Oftentimes, the only voice they had was their constitutional right to vote. Rather, I want to think of a time when I, as a young African-American kid, would go to the polls with my parents, who lifted me up to the levers for the candidate of their choice, to pull the levers for the candidates of their choice. I even remember discussions, many discussions, about why they may have split the ticket. Well, I know it was because they wanted to ensure that the right person was in the right office because they deserved to be there, not because of party affiliation. I know they were driven by the pure satisfaction of having a say in their government, which they loved, fought wars for, and paid their taxes. I'm here today because any change to the Constitution and any attack on the Minnesota democracy is an attack on those same values that I proudly proclaim. If I don't, then who will? If I don't, then how do I face the memories of my ancestors with a clear conscience? If I don't, then who will stand up for more than 700,000 plus Minnesotans who will be denied access to vote as a result of this amendment? I think the trajectory of history should always be to expand voting rights and not roll them back. Thank you.
So I'm happy to open it up to any questions. Yes?
I'm curious as to what will the consequence be for the banks who are supporting this amendment? Will they have, should this bill not pass, will they have some sort of, responsibility in your supporting this amendment?
I think that what our report shows is that the banks absolutely have a responsibility and are, in fact, the drivers of this amendment. That what we can see is that through the extraordinary dollars that banks are investing in our election system, they're moving an agenda that now hinges on restricting the right to vote of all of the rest of Minnesotans who are suffering at the hands of their very narrow economic agenda.
Dan, could this argument be made about any GOP-backed issues at the Capitol? I mean, banks obviously care about, I mean, these are some pretty heady allegations to me that, you know, these banks are trying to restrict votes and restrict voters from access to the polls. I mean, couldn't they make the argument that they want a better business climate and Republicans are more in line with their beliefs, that perhaps they want lesser regulations, which Republicans are pushing? Couldn't this be, you know, an argument that's made on any issue that Republicans are backing? And why are you using it on this?
Because the effect, I think money in politics is about cause and effect. And the effect of the dollars that the banks in Minnesota are investing, right, the top executives of these banks, is to move a photo ID amendment that is restricting the right to vote. In essence, what we're seeing happen is in order for the banks to move their agenda, they've now decided that they need to rewrite the rules of the game to benefit themselves. And that's what photo ID is. It's an attempt to fundamentally change the rules of our democracy to benefit the wealthiest and the most powerful.
And do you know whether any of these groups, whether it's the Chamber or Minnesota Forward or the Minnesota Business Partnership, have actually taken a stand on photo ID at all?
I think that's a good question and one that should be asked of them. What we can clearly see is...
But you're the one here making the argument.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, did you ask them about this, or did you consult with any of their lobbyists?
What we've concentrated on is following the path of the dollars from top bank executives to the GOP and from the GOP to this photo ID amendment. You can see that path for yourself. And what we see is a clear link between the dollars that top bank executives are investing and this photo ID amendment.
Are you going so far, though, as to actually allege that this idea was initiated or originated with bank executives for the photo ID law or amendment?
You know, I can't speak to where this idea originated. We know that ALEC, which is a national in scope, a national organization funded by enormous corporate interests, has been moving photo ID legislation in 38 states across the country. We think that what we're seeing here is simply the Minnesota version of that. There's frankly nothing original about the photo ID amendment that's been introduced in Minnesota. It's really been cut and pasted from Alec's playbook.
And this is nothing illegal that you're alleging here?
No.
I haven't read your whole report, but kind of piggybacking on what Tom said, nothing that I've seen is focused, the spending is not focused specifically on this issue. It's focused on a Republican agenda, which should surprise no one. So how do you pull out this one issue and say this cabal of bankers is trying to limit the right to vote? Well, they're trying to do a lot of things that they feel the Republicans will do for them.
So why is it that we're talking about introducing photo ID legislation in Minnesota at all? There's never been a case of voter impersonation in Minnesota. So it begs the question, well, if there's no problem to be solved, why are we even having a discussion in our state about photo ID? It's coming from somewhere, and someone's funding it. What you can see is that bank executives, who may have a broad agenda, I wouldn't deny that for a second, I'm sure they have multiple self-interests, are moving an agenda that, in part, is about restricting access to the polls.
In part.
Mm-hmm.
Are you suggesting all this money is not going into voter ID?
All this money is going into legislators who are moving photo ID.
And a number of other things that these funders agree with.
Mm-hmm. But in a time where the state is facing still a very steep recovery in an economic recession, where jobs should be a top priority, where helping people stay in their homes should be a top priority, while helping our schools stay afloat should be a top priority, legislative Republicans have started a conversation about restricting access to the polls. And it begs the question, why, of all of the urgent priorities our state faces, they want to have a conversation about restricting the right to vote.
Are you suggesting that individuals withdraw accounts from these banks?
You know, I would say that it's up to individuals about how they want to hold banks accountable. What we're saying is that the outcome of the investment of bank executives in our elections is one that's hurting our democracy. And I think everyone should, you know, consider their own action about how they want to react to that. Yes?
Okay, with that being said, how does the average citizen take note to the banks about how they're funding the Republicans who are in favor of this amendment, how this would affect them and how they can take a stand and, you know, let them know the exact consequences of their funding?
Yep. So I think what we've seen just in these last few days here in Minnesota is that people have really woken up to the extraordinary threat that photo ID poses to our democracy. We've heard that from Congressman Ellison. We heard that from a group of clergy yesterday. Certainly there's going to be more actions to come. And I think that, you know, what you're beginning to see is a public wake up to the fact that this is a very, very insidious amendment, which, you know, has a design to rewrite the rules of the game to benefit the 1%.
Dan, since you're here talking about money and making this allegation, can you give us an idea of who your major backers are?
Sure. So TakeAction Minnesota is a membership organization. We have 14,000 dues-paying members across the state of Minnesota. We also have 27 organizational members that also pay dues. Those are the folks that fund this and fund our work. And
top 4 or 5?
Top members?
Top donors to your work.
Well, so our work is funded by 14,000 dues-paying members. So we got folks all across the state that are chipping in. Every night we have a group of folks that go knock on doors and try to raise dollars. So we're, you know, picking up $20 or $30 contributions on the door every night of the week, including in February.
I guess, do you have major donors beyond the $20 and $30 who are?
Yeah, we most certainly do. So it includes our organizational members, right? So, you know, we work with a number of labor unions in the state. We work with a number of, I should say, foundations that also support our work on the charitable side of our organization. You know, you can certainly look at the list on our website to see who our organizational members are.
Well, we're talking about voter ID.
Yeah.
And has anybody studied how many people would be affected? I've heard 700,000, I've heard 200,000, I've heard. Do we have any hard data on that?
Well, I would start by saying that, you know, the sky's the limit, and I think that's one of the scary things about messing with the state constitution. What we know for a fact, coming from the Secretary of State, is that there are 215,000 eligible Minnesota voters who do not have a photo ID. In addition to that, anyone who's registered on Election Day, and in the last election that was upwards of 500,000 people, would also have this as a barrier. Now, in addition to that, anyone who's ever lost their wallet should think twice about this amendment. Anyone who plans to move in the fall of this year should be concerned about this amendment, or the fall of any year for that matter. I mean, it's important to note that demographically, we know that the elderly are going to be affected by this. We know college students will be affected by this. We know the working poor, who often are more mobile, and are going to be affected by this. But any person who's had the experience of losing their wallet will also be affected by this. Any person, right? Every day there are thousands of Minnesotans who misplace their wallet or have it stolen. And so it's important to keep in mind, this is much farther reach than just, you know, a few constituencies. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans.
You could still register on Election Day, could you not? I mean, you could design a system where you'd have to have photo ID, but you could register on Election Day.
Well, you know, it remains to be seen, and I'd say the authors of this right now have been completely unclear about if that's going to be the case. And I'd still make the point, 215,000 eligible Minnesota voters, people who are currently eligible and able to participate in our elections who do not have a photo ID, this would be a barrier, in addition to any person who just so happens on the day of election to not have their wallet on them.
Has this requirement been in place long enough anywhere else to see whether it affected voter turnout in an election or election outcomes?
You know, I can't answer that question right now. I would point you to the east in Wisconsin, where there are 3 lawsuits pending right now on photo ID for exactly the reasons we're talking about. All sorts of, unintended consequences have already been discovered of people who have been, voting for decades, who suddenly are unable to cast a ballot because they don't have a birth certificate or they, don't have a marriage license or divorce papers.
You mentioned recent opposition to this, by most of the House Republicans are moving forward, these competitive votes, considering what's on the ballot. What's next? We have this report today. What's this look like before they vote on it, and then after, presuming it ends up on the ballot in the fall?
Yep. So we're continuing to organize. I'd say we've had some great progress. We have over 21,000 Minnesotans who have signed a petition in opposition to voter ID. More than 10,000 of those folks have jumped on board just in the last 2 weeks, so that's a good sign. I think people are waking up to this issue. I think tomorrow is going to be an important action. There's going to be a number of folks gathering at the Capitol here to speak out about, how our democracy is being taken from us. I think as this goes forward, we're going to have to keep up a steady drumbeat and continue to relentlessly educate the public about the consequences of photo ID. Are there any other questions?
How'd you figure out where all that money came from?
We've been digging through papers for several months to be able to do this. Much of this is publicly available. Much of this, in fact, I think pretty much all of this is publicly available through campaign finance reporting, through the Campaign Finance Board. All right. Well, thank you very much, and we're happy to answer any other questions offline. So, thank you.